Yeah, and welcome everybody. It's fantastic to see so many old friends and even more fresh faces, all working towards a better startup ecosystem in Africa. That really is a testament to that connection between Germany and Africa. As Michael has said, I've literally just come in from Johannesburg and very excited to be here with you today. Africa and South Africa in particular has got a very special place in my heart. I've been fortunate enough to call that place my second home for the past, going at 7 years now. And today, I'd like to share some of my experiences with you in building startups and raising funds between Germany and Africa. It was back in 2017, I just founded my new venture, Zeon, and I was looking for the right market to run my MVP, my minimum viable product. Zeon is operating in what is normally a heavily regulated and change-resistant industry. So what I was looking for is a place with a world-class business infrastructure, but a different attitude towards innovation, piloting, and pivoting. Well, not long thereafter that I ended up packing my little suitcase and flew down to South Africa. And little did I know that I would not be packing that suitcase again for a couple of years and end up living in South Africa for some time to come. What has really struck me is the willingness that I've encountered in South Africa and in Africa to embrace innovation and to allow new players into a market, to allow and embrace change. In my 6 years, going at 7 shortly, of working between Africa and Europe, there's something that I've noticed time and time again. When speaking with particularly German and European investors, business people, corporates, they're always looking at the risks, and they're weighing up the risks of operating in Africa versus the opportunities that may present themselves. But I would actually like to challenge that, and I would say, and I will say, that most of the time your risks are your opportunities in Africa. We've heard a few examples of that here today already, such as the lack of electricity infrastructure being an amazing opportunity for leapfrogging in green and renewable energy, or issues with corruption being an amazing opportunity to move forward with e-governance. In our case, it's the high crime rate that helps us to push forward with technology to fight that crime. Well, I'll also say, yes, risks as opportunities sounds wonderful, but of course, building a company in Africa, anywhere really, isn't always a piece of cake. It goes from your big ticket items, such as the fact that, of course, opening an office in South Africa means that we need to have diesel generators to keep the lights on, literally, to your small little things. And I remember shortly after I arrived there and decided to set up that South African entity, that I found myself sitting at SARS, the revenue service, trying to get my tax ID, and that lady was hunting me down for not having the right form stamped in the right kind of blue ink. So yes, you do find these issues, but to be fair, you can find those anywhere in the world. I told you that we're operating in a highly regulated industry. So a few words on what we're doing at Zeon. Our mission is to fight crime with technology. How we're doing that is by building software that is used by security services to detect emergencies faster, respond more efficiently, and essentially get help to a person in need quicker. looking at the South African situation, in South Africa alone, only since January 1st this year, we've seen over 7,000 murders. Only since January 1st this year. The response to that, as a country, and that's something I really appreciate about that South African ingenuity, is for the public and private sector to come together. In South Africa, we've got twice as many private security officers as policemen and military personnel combined. And together, they're working on solving the crime problem. Now, in South Africa, there is a saying that I've grown to love, and that says, you always make a plan. No matter what issue you're facing, whether it's the aforementioned electricity problems or whether it's your administrative issues, you always make a plan. And that's something that we've done at Zeon and in my entrepreneurial journey on the continent. And South Africa for us, as a German company going in there completely blue-eyed, has proven to be a wonderful bridgehead. So from Cape Town, South Africa, we've since expanded into other countries on the continent, from nearby Namibia to further away Kenya or Uganda. So going back to the first part of today's topic, building startups between Europe and Africa, the combination of your German head office, your partly German team, and your South African team as a bridgehead into the market is something that has worked incredibly well for us. Now, the second part is raising funds. We've heard a few startups and a couple of investors sharing their experiences about fundraising in Africa before. So at Zeon, over the years, we've raised about $7 million in venture capital, and we've deployed most of that into our South African operation, into the African market. What I've found is a hesitancy, especially with European investors, to invest into South African entities. Not just businesses, but entities. And I've seen that many other startups and brilliant founders across Africa, building great businesses there on the ground, would actually domicile their entities abroad. You have a South African company delivering services in South Africa, but being domiciled in Mauritius, in the UK, Delaware, or where not. And while that might make fundraising easier, it's an issue to get that and getting that ecosystem going. Because what you want to see is you want to see those exits, and you want to see capital dispersed locally to key personnel, to early investors, to team members, for them to then get the next ventures going locally. But if those funds go straight back overseas, it poses a challenge for that ecosystem. So one call to action for our European investors and investors globally be to really embrace those African entities and African businesses. Now, the other thing and the other important call to action that I would like to deliver today is to our African governments and to the market authorities and regulators. We've heard already that a number of startup acts are under deliberation or in the process of being implemented, and that is crucial in getting more funding into the continent. As long as you have got strict exchange barriers, issues with getting work permits, and issues with getting exit returns reinvested, it will be a hindrance to the growth of the ecosystem. And then lastly, it's up to all of us, entrepreneurs, investors, ecosystem builders, to spread the word and to motivate more people to go out there and to start building startups and start investing into Africa. So from my perspective, thank you very much for your attention today. Thanks for joining us here this afternoon. And let's all make a plan to bring more business into Africa. Now it's time for your questions. There in the back. Do we have a second microphone? Coming up.
Hi. You can hear me, right?
Loud and clear.
Okay, cool. So I wanted to find out from your perspective, is building a business in Africa profitable from your experience? And how have you found has worked to convince investors in Europe that giving you their money will be profitable? Do they look at you as a founder, or what are they looking at to then invest?
So the number one reason why investors have decided not to invest when I approached them was always because they were not familiar or not comfortable with the market, or more specifically, the market geography. So that has been a major issue. However, those that have invested were willing to look past that and actually look at the merits of the business itself. And when looking at the merits of the business itself, it proved to be, thus far at least, a good investment case for them. And that's why I'm really advocating for that stigma of investing into African businesses or African entities to drop. Yeah, here in front.
Hello? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. You said you had scaled across multiple countries in Africa. So I was just wondering, what did you see as like challenges in doing that? I've spent some time now on the continent, and I do feel that startups, I think it is very challenging because of government, because of regulation, because of cultural differences, language differences. Yeah, what was your experience in that regard?
So of course your experience in scaling on the continent will depend greatly on what business and industry you're in. With us, we're software as a service business. So we don't need to ship equipment across borders. We don't necessarily need to hire personnel on the ground. That makes life a lot easier. How it works with us is we've got our entity in South Africa, and we're using that to contract with customers all over Africa. There are certain hurdles when it comes to banking and foreign currencies and all of that. But in general, and speaking about the markets that we're operating in, which predominantly are in your SADC region and East Africa, I found it to be pretty straightforward, to be honest. The business culture is similar, at least in our industry. The customers are quite similar as well. Pain points are similar. There's a huge market that faces mostly similar problems, whether it's in our case crime and fragmented emergency services, or in other areas, to go with the previous example, electricity shortages. And I found that as long as people face a similar issue and you've got similar grounds for the same solution to be deployed, those other hindrances can be resolved. Yes.
Have European or US partners that would want to acquire you or merge with you. You're developing the story for Africa, but you also have to develop your exit story from day zero already. So please let us into your thoughts on that.
When it comes to exit stories, I always find that there are sort of two different trains of thoughts. One half of the room will say, if the entrepreneur has a clear exit plan from day one, they're not really in it with all their heart, and therefore they will fail. And the other half of the room might say, if they do not have a clear exit plan, they're being delusional, and thus they will fail. So I believe the truth generally lies somewhere in the middle. So with Zeon and our approach towards it, first and foremost, we are building a profitable business that serves a purpose and that creates an environment in which its team members and colleagues get out of bed in the morning for a reason. That's the first principle. Now, when it comes to exit opportunities, I think it's important to be aware of what is out there, but exit opportunities, in my opinion, should not be prioritized over building a sustainable business. Specifically in our case, we find that a lot of the global players, so in our case, global security companies, are operating in Africa as well. We're starting to work with their African businesses first, serving them as customers, and we're now getting more and more requests from those same customers to do what we did for them in Africa, elsewhere on the globe as well. So from an exit perspective, that lends itself to at least the opportunity of selling to some of those larger international corporates, or going one step further, looking at who actually owns those companies. It's mostly private equity and pension funds. Further questions on building businesses between Africa and Europe or fundraising therefore?
That your growth in Africa would have been faster than if you'd grown it here in Europe?
We could not have done what we did in Africa and Europe. So therefore the question of growth doesn't really present itself as growth in Europe would have been from a basis of 0. Launching this business in Africa was the only viable way of doing it, because only in that environment were we able to actually work with real-life customers, work with their data, get into their control rooms, go on patrol together with them, learn from their operations, and actually pivot and pilot that product until it was reliable enough to then get all of your fancy certifications, without which a European customer would not even let you get through the door.
Thank you. I'm Sam, and hello.
There you go.
I knew you were looking for me. Maybe I missed it. Sorry. I wanted to know, I'm just looking at the presentation of the keynote, and I'm like, so what if I'm just at the ideation phase for my startup, and I kind of approach you? What do you look out for to tell? Because, I'm still at the ideation phase. So is a startup that is still at the ideation phase? I don't know if you can actually call that a startup if it's still on the ideation phase, but is this something you can work collaboratively with the founder to kind of see if you could raise fund for the person, or you just basically focus on founders who have already kickstarted something and at least gone beyond the ideation phase?
Do you mean me and Zeon specifically, or my advice to founders in general?
I think in general.
Yeah. Well, each business case is, of course, unique. But at the end of the day, the one thing that they all have in common is you need to validate your product market fit. So, and in order to validate your product market fit, you first need to be able to prove that what you promise to build, you can build. And secondly, that the people whom you think will buy it are actually buying it. So, and those come at different stages. So if you're building like a high-tech hardware product, the first bit will be much more tricky as compared to an e-commerce product, for instance. What I would always advise, and that's the reason why back then I very quickly packed that suitcase and flew down to South Africa, is to try to get that customer appetite validated as quickly as possible. Once you have the customer appetite validated, and you can then, with much more comfort and also with greater resources at your disposal, start working on the product and delivering on that promise. One follow-up?
What I get from your answer is that if you are a founder with an idea that is still stuck at the ideation stage, then maybe one key step you could take would be to kind of make sure that you've validated that there is a market for your idea and that this market is willing to consume the idea once it's ready. And then once you have that validation, you can actually then start making connections or contacts to reach out to maybe fundraisers or investors, because then investors would likely invest if they know that there is a viable market waiting for your product or for your service. That's your answer, right?
Yeah, that is correct. And then once you've got that initial validation, it is in most cases not going to be a clear 100% yes. This is what everyone has waited for. That would be quite rare, but in my experience, your customer validation goes in sort of like cycles. So you'll go out with an idea, you'll get perhaps 20% of it right and validated by your customer versus 80% that you have to discard. Then you go back to the drawing board, you work on those 20%, you go out again to your potential customers, or even you might learn that it's a different target group whom you must speak to, and then start that process again and again and again. So as you go through those iterations and those pivots. And the pace at which you can do that in Africa is really phenomenal. And especially for industries that are a bit trickier or more change resistant, you'll be able to do those iterations and those pilots and pivots much quicker than elsewhere in the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, Finn Plotz, founder of Zeon.
Pleasure. Thank you.